Hi, welcome to our focus on how to analyze language in the texts and the tasks that your English for Specific Purposes students are either preparing to carry out in English or they're already having to carry out in English. So I know that for most students, the idea of analyzing language is kind of scary. And especially when we throw in words like genre analysis or discourse analysis or conversation analysis, that kind of thing, it sounds kind of big and scary and intellectual and beyond us. And so my overall message for you not only in this lecture, but also in the tasks that I've created for you, in our discussion, in this entire part of our unit, is that it is not beyond you. You can do this. You are a language user. You have already mastered how to read different kinds of texts, how to take part in different kinds of conversations, and so you are perfectly poised to figure this out, and I'm going to help you. So what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to watch this lecture unless you have two things ready and printed out. The first is a handout called How to Analyze Language in Written or Oral Text. And the second piece, very important, How to Assemble a Crib. And yes, indeedy do, this means how to assemble a baby crib. So why do you need these two pieces? You need the list of 10 points as kind of a good graphic organizer, I think, for this lecture. If I were seeing you in a classroom today, I would hand this to you and as a way to take notes, or at least to organize your notes. And you need the printout, the text, How to Assemble a Crib, because this is what we're going to tackle together, and I'm going to lead you through this. Okay, so I've called our handout How to Analyze Language in a Written or Oral Text in 10 Easy Steps. And I really do think when we break it down, and if I give you lots of examples, and we tackle this text together, that you'll agree with me. It's at least not as hard as you thought it was. Okay. So the thing I want to say before we tackle these 10 steps is when I think about analyzing the language in a text, meaning in a written text, whether that's an email or a text from a handout, whatever it is, or from a task that someone's carrying out, like giving a presentation, or giving a presentation with a Q&A afterwards, question and answer afterwards, whatever it is, I think of the metaphor of panning for gold. And I think that one of the reasons I think about this metaphor is because panning for gold is a long process, and there are lots of different kinds of kind of sifting mechanisms that you use when you're panning for gold. I'd like you to think about each of these 10 steps as we're sifting with a slightly different kind of sieve or whatever it is that we're using to pan for that gold. And what is the gold? The things that we can bring our students to notice about how language works, and the things that we can teach them about how language works. So it's a powerful tool. And do I think you're going to do it perfectly from the beginning? Of course not. I'm still developing, and I've been doing this for quite a while. But let's go ahead and get started. So by the way, if you haven't printed out these two pieces, please stop the lecture at this point, print them out, read the How to Assemble a Crib, and then rejoin us in the lecture. Okay, I'll assume that you have both pieces ready. The first thing that I suggest that you do, not because it's the most important, but because I think it's the most accessible for most of us, is to notice the vocabulary that is used in the text or in the task. And what does this mean? Well, I've started out with a written text because I think that's a little bit easier because it's stable, it's visual, it's not going anywhere, it's not ephemeral, you can keep returning to it. What I'm looking for when I'm looking for the vocabulary is I'm looking for what are the low occurrence vocabulary. In other words, if I were to read anything, if I were to go out and listen to anything right now, I would not likely hear these words. And once you've got that collection of words, which ones make sense that someone writing or speaking this kind of text would need? Now, one thing I want to say, so we're talking about low frequency words and high frequency words. What do I mean by high frequency words? Well, look with me for a moment at how to assemble a crib. If you look at the first step, lay the headboard flat on the ground, and you look at all the words, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences in that point. You see words like the, on, with, by, for, and those are high frequency words. In other words, if we were to turn on a radio right now and listen to whoever's speaking, likely we would hear them say all of those words. They occur all the time. They're not special. It's not that students don't need to know them, but teaching English for specific purposes is about teaching the special, teaching what's unique about this particular task or this particular text. So those are the words we would not pick up on. So let's go back to that first point. What are some words that I notice? The word lay, and in fact, lay comes up once, twice in that first point. Now that's a verb that is probably, if I think about it, when I think about putting something physical together, and that's the genre that this would belong to, physically putting something together, carrying out physical directions to put something together. The word lay is probably going to come up, no matter whether it's a crib, a table, whatever it is that you're assembling. Some other words that I notice there, I notice attach in the second point. If you skip down to number 2, I see the word inside in that point. That's another one. If I think about it, attach and inside. If I'm putting something together and I'm following instructions, chances are it's going to use the word attach, and probably it's going to be talking about the outside of something, the inside of something. So lay, attach, and inside. So far we've got low frequency words, 3 low frequency words that we could probably teach to our students, and not only would it help them understand this particular set of directions, but they could apply it to all directions that they're following to carry out a task. Another word I see in point number 2, right about the middle, insert, so to put inside, and hardware. Hardware. That is a word that's probably going to come up no matter what it is that you're putting together. Looking on the rest of that page, some other words that strike me. If I look at point number 3, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, I see the word dowels. Now, we don't use dowels when we're putting computers together, but when we're putting together almost anything else, there are often dowels, which are those little tiny wooden pegs that stick out, that there's usually a hole in the corresponding piece, and you put the two together. So dowels is very likely going to be important. And the word screws, and the word, let's see, screws. Yeah, screws. And so I would say, and in fact, from the word screws, I would probably extrapolate, even though I don't see any other words related to that, I would probably teach those as well. So we've got screw, there might be nuts, there might be, what are some other words we use? Screwdriver, there might be wrench, right? So I don't see those words right here, but it's got me thinking about some vocabulary that probably my students would need to use. I do see screwdriver. It's in point number 3, about 6 lines down at the end, screwdriver. Okay, so let's go back over this first step. The first step I suggest you take, whether you're analyzing a written text or an oral text, is to listen for those low-frequency vocabulary words. They wouldn't be heard if we just stepped out of the room right now and listened to someone talking. We probably wouldn't hear them used. And they make common sense to you when you think about the particular task or the particular kind of text. And again, we're not preparing our students to read this text. With English for specific purposes, you are preparing your students to read every text like this that they encounter for the rest of their careers. So that is my suggestion on kind of analyzing for the vocabulary that you encounter. Okay, now the next step I have there, step number 2, is notice any prevalent word forms. So what do I mean by that? Well, in some kind of text or in some kind of genres, you might see some patterns where there are lists. Like you might see, for example, that there's 3 verbs in a row. For example, it might say something like, you should sift, pour, and stir the flour, right? So you've got 3 right in a row. Maybe that kind of pattern comes up in recipes, for example. Or you might see a pattern of 3 adjectives, like rabbits are small, camouflage, and quick, something like that. Where does that come up? Actually, a lot of biology readings that are describing mammals or other animals actually often use 3 adjectives in a row. So is that all that you're looking for? No, you're kind of opening your mind up to see if there's anything you notice about the kind of word forms that are used. Now, as I look over our reading, I don't notice any lists of adjectives or any lists of verbs. What I do notice is that many of the sentences, not all, but many of the sentences, including all of the sentences that are kind of the starter sentences, the heading for each piece, 1, 2, 3, all of them start with a verb. And the verb is in simple form. Lay, attach, a lot of them say attach, check, slide. Yeah, check, slide. Wow, there's only 3. That's interesting. For this entire text, there's only 3 verbs that are used over and over again in the 10 steps. Now, I need to ask myself, why? Why would there be so many sentences that begin with a simple verb? Well, when I look at it, what I notice is these are commands. And the language arts way to say that is these are imperative sentences. So that makes sense. When you're reading directions, directions are being given directly to you. And so in English, when we give an imperative like read this, print this, do this, we take off the subject of the sentence, you, and we simply start with the verb. To my knowledge, that is the only time that we leave the subject off of a sentence in formal academic English. So I don't notice any patterns except that one. That's one that I notice, okay? Now, when I look at step number 3, take note of the functional language. Notice what I've written there, the Mad Libs of your teaching dreams. Okay, so functional language. Let's go back over what that means. Functional language is when you have chunks of language that can actually be memorized and used over and over again within the same discourse. So, for example, the discourse of calling your doctor to ask for an appointment. There's probably some pieces in there that you could teach your students that they could use over and over again, no matter which doctor's office they're calling, no matter what the illness is, they could probably use this. For example, they could use the language, could I see the doctor today? Or could I have an appointment with the doctor today? So that's an entire piece, an entire sentence that you could teach your students, and they could use again and again and again when that situation arises. What are some other pieces? Students would probably be asked, what's your illness, or what's the problem? And so they'd need to be able to say something like, I have a fever and I don't feel well. So I have, and then maybe a blank, and I don't feel well. I have a fever and I don't feel well. I have a headache and I don't feel well. I have a stomach problem and I don't feel well. That kind of thing. So any of those pieces that you could write up on the board or put on environmental print or have the students repeat after you to memorize, that's functional language. And the reason that I have Mad Libs written there is because many of us, especially those of us who grew up in the U.S., we might know what Mad Libs are. Mad Libs are kind of a game that children play in which part of a sentence, or sorry, part of a text is written out, but it's missing pieces. And there'll be a blank, and underneath it'll say adjective, right? And so the game is that you will say to your partner, give me an adjective, and they give you an adjective. But they don't know why they're giving you an adjective. You write that in. Give me a noun. They give you a noun, you write it in. Then you read it back to them. So it's got the rest of the story. It was just missing some key adjectives, some key nouns, some key verbs, that kind of thing. And so these are some of the most important pieces that you can pick up from whatever the task or the text is that you are analyzing for your students. The Mad Libs of your teaching dreams. So let's take a look and let's see if we can see any functional language. Take a look at point number 2. So point number 2, it begins, attach the latch brackets onto the inside of the headboard. Well, one thing I can see that would be functional language immediately is attach the to the. Attach the to the. And in fact, when you look throughout this reading, that is a pattern that shows up again and again. Attach the mattress support to the base of the crib. Attach the stationary rail to the headboard and footboard. So that's the kind of pattern we're looking for. Something that students could learn. It would help them tackle a written text. It would help them tackle a text they're listening to. And it would also help them produce, whether they're producing in writing, they're producing in speaking. Attach the to the. What else do we notice? Also in point number 2, I see move on to the next step. That's the third line down, continuing on to the fourth line. Move on to the next step. I bet that that's something that comes up a lot in directions. And very similar to it, if you go to step number 3, the last sentence, it says skip to the next step. That's another piece. So far we've got 3 pieces of functional language we could teach to students. Attach the to the, move on to the next step, skip to the next step. Excellent. What else? Well, when I look across this reading, one of the things I see is there are not a lot, but several sentences that begin with if. And when I think about that, that makes sense. Because when people are putting things together, often directions are written, maybe they're written for several different kinds of cribs. And so there will be some if language. If you are putting together a X crib, then do this. If you are putting together a crib that has no slats, do this, that kind of thing. And so I see in step number 3, about 6 lines down, if there is a location to screw these pieces together, then you should do so. And when I look farther down, step number 4, I see about 6 lines down, if your crib is new, you may need to attach some parts. And farther down in that same point, number 4, if you have a crib with 2 drop rails, then you will attach the mattress support. Okay, now we're on to something. We have another piece of functional language. If there is a, then you, right? So that kind of thing. And I know it doesn't perfectly match with all of these examples, but it gets pretty close. And again, functional language, that if you go back to the panning for gold kind of idea, this is a different kind of sieve, and we just caught a lot in that sieve. So let's go back over. So far we found some low frequency vocabulary that makes sense for following the language of directions. We've noticed just a little pattern that lots of sentences begin with a verb in the simple form because it's an imperative. And now we've found some functional language, some really key functional language. Now we need to go on to the next step. Notice the verb tenses. Okay, now what does verb tense mean? Verb tense is present, I see, past, simple past, I saw, progressive, I am seeing, future, I will see, and then we have the perfect tenses. Present perfect, I have seen, past perfect, I had seen, future perfect, I will have seen. Okay, so you get the idea. Verb tenses are when you change the verb to show the time. Present, past, present continuous or present progressive happening right now, future, that kind of thing. So what are some things that I notice? Well, we've already noticed one thing. We've noticed that there are many sentences that are written in the simple present because they are commands. Lay the cardboard flat on the ground. Attach the latch brackets onto the inside of the headboard. Slide the dowels onto the latch brackets. You get it. There's a lot of examples of that. Is that the only pattern? No. We also have a pattern of future tense. So take a look with me. Take a look with me on the second page of the handout. Look at point number 6. Point number 6. The last sentence in that point. This will prevent your drop rail from falling all the way down to the floor. This will prevent. So this is future tense. Will plus prevent. We've got will plus the simple form of the verb. Is that the only example of future? No, there's at least one other, and you might be able to find more, but I see at least one other. If you go to point 10, the third sentence, the third line down, this will help keep your baby safe while using your baby crib. Will help, or will help keep. And so you have will, and you have the simple form of the verb. So definitely we've got simple present used with the commands, and we've got future. Is that all? I see another pattern. And it also uses the simple form of the verb, and it's not exactly a tense, so work with me here. But I notice that there are often modals plus the simple form of the verb. And often the modal is should. Now what's a modal? A modal is a word that we put in front of the verb, and then we use the verb, usually in present, in simple form, and they're words like should, could, can, may, might, ought to, have to, those kinds of things, have got to, those kinds of things. So when I look at the second page of our handout, I see 3 examples just with should. Go to point number 5. Look at the last 2 lines of point number 5. You should first attach the bottom of the rods. You should attach. Now they've added the word first. I wouldn't have done that as a writer of English, but they put it in between the modal and the verb. Should attach. So this makes sense, doesn't it? When you are reading directions or you're listening to directions, someone is telling you how to do something, and it makes sense that they would give you advice on how to do it. And one of the ways we often give advice is with should. You should do this. You should do this first. Let's look for another example. Look at number 7. Number 7. Step number 7. It should not wobble when you try and shake it. That's the third sentence. It should not wobble. Should wobble. Now we've put a not between there. It should not wobble. This makes sense. Telling us how to be safe, right? How to make sure that we've actually done a good job up until this point in putting together the crib. Look at point number 8. Point number 8. Look at the second line down. There should be no more than 2 fingers width. There should be no more than 2 fingers width. Should be. Should plus the simple form of be, which is be. Should be. Okay, so what do we got for verb tenses? We know that we use simple present. We use it because we're giving commands. We know that we use future at times, will keep, will prevent, and we know that we're using at least the modals of should. And I see some other modals actually. I challenge you, see if you can find them on the first page as well, and not just should. Okay? So that's what it means to look at verb tenses. And notice with the modals, I stretched it a little bit, but I was noticing something interesting going on with the verbs. Now, moving on. Take note of the sentence types. One of the things that you need to prepare your students to do is to be prepared for, are they going to read lots of questions or hear lots of questions? Will they be expected to produce lots of questions or write lots of questions? Will there be lots of imperatives? That means commands. Will there be lots of exclamatories? What does that mean? Well, just like I show on your handout, it's something with the exclamation point at the end. So adding emphasis or adding kind of excitement to the sentence. And also declaratives. So declaratives are when information is being shared with the reader. And so what do we see? Well, we already know that there are lots of imperatives, right? If you look at point number 1, lay the headboard flat on the ground. Then the second sentence of point number 1, lay the headboard flat on the ground with the side facing inwards to the crib showing up. And then the next sentence is actually not an imperative necessarily. The third sentence is not an imperative. The next sentence, some beds, is not an imperative. Go to the next sentence. Simply choose one of the pieces and lay that one on the ground facing up. So in point number 1, 3 of those sentences are imperatives. So we definitely know, even just from point number 1, we definitely are going to have to teach our students how imperatives work. They might have already taken in this idea that in English we need a subject, we need a verb, and we might need an object. And here you are, you need to teach them, actually with imperatives, you don't need the subject. You don't need to say you. You check, you lay, you attach, right? You don't need to do that. So we know that now. We need to highlight that with students. But there's also declaratives. There's also information here that is just giving information to the students, the reader, rather. Look with me at point number 3. The first sentence that's highlighted, attach the stationary rail to the headboard and footboard. That's an imperative. That is a command. Look at the next sentence. Most stationary rails will have dowels on the ends. Is that an imperative? You're right. It's not. That is a declarative. It's giving us information about the world. Most stationary rails will have dowels on the ends. Okay? Look at the next sentence. Slide the dowels into the latch brackets on the headboard and footboard on one side of the crib and screw them to the crib. Is that an imperative? Yes, it is. It's giving us a command. How do you know? Look at the first word. It's a verb, and it's a verb that it's understood we need to carry out. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. This attachment might require you to screw the rail in place. Is that an imperative or a declarative? It's a declarative. It starts with a noun, this attachment, and although it's implying there's something we should do, it's not actually a command. So after you get done listening to this lecture, one thing you might want to do is just kind of try your hand in noticing the difference, because in point number 3 and in point number 4, it switches back quite a lot. And in fact, in point number 4, there are more declaratives than there are imperatives. Okay. So we have talked about vocabulary, word forms, functional language, verb tenses, sentence types, and now we need to look at how are ideas connected to each other. So what kinds of things are we looking for here? We're looking for anything that would help the reader understand how to connect a new idea to a past idea, like first, second, then, finally. We would also be looking for any adverbials like because that connect one idea with another, with cause and effect. We might be looking for what are called fanboys. And fanboys, F is for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Fanboys. And those stand for a collection of ways that we can connect two complete sentences. Gina went to the store and she bought a coat. I didn't, but anyways, that's a sample sentence. That's an example of a fanboy. And so we're looking for any ways, even semicolons. What's a semicolon? It's the dot with the little comma underneath. We're looking for any ways that you can connect ideas. So as I look across this, what do I see? You know, the only real connection between ideas that I see, that I notice, and you might notice something else, is I notice the use of the word if. The way that if works, if is always part of a complex sentence. There's the if part. If the crib is broken, you should not use it. There's the if part, which is the dependent part of the sentence. I can't just walk up and say, if the crib is broken. It's not a complete sentence. But you should not use it is a complete sentence. You might think I'm still crazy if I walk up to you and say you should not use it, but it is a complete sentence. So if is a way that we can connect ideas. We connect the idea of what you might be looking for with what you should do, if that is the case. So the only thing that I notice as I look through here for the ways that ideas are connected is the use of if, which is an adverbial. Okay, and you might notice, and let me know if you notice anything else, but that's the only thing I notice. Take note of how morphology works. Now, what's morphology again? We're kind of going back to second language acquisition, back to our unit where we looked at how language works. Morphology is you've got root words like book, and then you've got prefixes and suffixes you can add that either change the grammar or they change the meaning. Okay, so with book, can we add any prefixes on that? No, we really can't if we mean the thing, an actual physical book. But we can add the morpheme of S if we want to make it plural. Now, if we take the word book as a verb, now we can add a prefix, pre-book. We add pre, and now we've changed the meaning of book. It means before, to book before. And if, again, we look at book as a verb, we can say booking, booked. I booked the hotel. I am booking the hotel now. I will book the hotel. So whenever you're adding an ending like ing or ed or s, or you're adding something at the beginning, that is morphology. So do we notice anything interesting? Do we notice, for example, lots of ing or ion, tion, like with imagination? Do we notice anything like that? The only thing that I notice about morphology as I look through this is I notice that there are lots of plural s's. So lots of times where we're adding an s to a noun to make it mean more than one. So for example, look at point number 1. Look at the second line that begins, you can recognize. Okay, look with me at that sentence. Look for plural s as I read along. You can recognize this side by the holes for the brackets or dowels that will usually exist on the inward side. So there we have 3 nouns in a row in which we've added an s to, a plural s, to show more than one. There's another great example at the bottom of point number 2. Look at the last 2 lines of point number 2. And as I read along, look for those plural s's. For newborns, you will want the base of the crib at the highest level, so you would attach the brackets or side rails at this level. Older babies will need a lower crib base. Okay, so when we think about step number 7, what we're looking for are any pieces of morphology that we could teach our students. The thing that I notice is the use of plural s, adding s to a noun to make more than one. Notice that last example, older babies. So probably what we would need to do is not just teach adding of s, but teaching of the spelling pattern, that when you add s to certain word endings, it becomes IES, not just s. Okay. All right. So we've made it through morphology. Now, we need to move on to notice any signs of formality or informality. Now, up until this point, we have really been looking at what's called grammatical competence. And grammatical competence, there's actually a reading this week in your, if you need to kind of brush up on communicative competencies, you can look at that. But grammatical competence is when you're looking at the tiny little units, the tiny little parts about how language works. Anything about grammar, anything about vocabulary, that kind of thing. Anything about functional language. That is grammatical competence. Now, with step number 8, we're switching gears to another competence. Look at that. Notice any signs of formality or informality. Which competence is that? Think about that for a moment. Okay, if you said sociolinguistic, you're right. Now we're looking at the relationship between the reader and the person reading. Is it an informal relationship? Is it very friendly? Is it very formal? And so what we're doing is one of the most important jobs that you have in ESP is helping your students become polite. Because one thing I think is quite true in ESP is that we can mix up the vocabulary, we can mix up other pieces, we can stumble in pronunciation, but if we stumble in politeness, we can lose someone. We can lose a customer, we can lose a client, we can anger someone who's working with our manager. And so we really, really need to be sensitive to and teach our students to notice how polite to be. And I also want to really emphasize, and I know you know, but I want to emphasize, the answer is not always to be super polite. Sometimes being super polite feels distant. You need to be the appropriate level of politeness. So, do you notice anything as you read through this about how formal or informal it is? Well, one thing I just noticed is that there's the use of you a lot. And so I think there's a direct relationship between the person who wrote this and the person reading it. It doesn't have slang. It doesn't have informal language. It's not very friendly. It just is to the point. I don't see any jokes within it. Sometimes when people are giving directions, they might intersperse kind of a joke. I don't see anything like that. So it's not super formal. On the other hand, it's not informal either. I don't see slang. I don't see any of that. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for in step number 8 when we're kind of testing out how formal or informal a text is. Step number 9. Take note of reader assisters. Now I said reader assisters, but really often you will be analyzing oral language as well. So take note of any language assisters, I should have said. So what does that mean when I say oral? So you might, for example, if you get hired by a school or a program or a hotel to create a English for Hotel Workers program, one of the things you might do is you might plant yourself in the lobby of a hotel and just listen to how the staff are interacting with customers. What kinds of things are they saying? How are they expressing them in English? And so for those kinds of interactions, you might see, for example, that when the front desk person says, okay, I want you to fill out this card, the front desk person might actually be handing a card and a pen to the customer. Now, why does that matter? Because if someone at a front hotel desk says something to you that you don't understand, but they're handing you a card with a pen, you can understand from the context what's being said. And so that is a language assister, not just a reading assister, but a language assister. So you're looking for any ways that someone could, especially if they're struggling with making sense of what's being said or expressing themselves, they would have other ways to make sense of it. So this is like in second language acquisition, Jim Cummins' contextualization. So looking for any contextualization. So when I look over this reading, the first thing that I notice is the steps are numbered. 1, 2, 3, and they go all the way through 10. They go all the way through 10. So one of the obvious assisters that you would teach your students to look for is to look for numbered steps. And that would help them to be able to pull apart language so that they at least know the beginning of a step and the end of a step, where it begins. Anything else? Another thing I notice is that each step has the overall step, kind of the main idea of the step, in bold in the first sentence. That's another huge assister. Now, with this particular text, there aren't any pictures, but I think it would be quite usual for a text like this to also have pictures with it. So that would be another assister that you could look at. Now, when we look at language assisters, when we look at anything that can assist a student with reading a text, for example, or expressing their meaning or understanding a meaning, we're looking at a different communicative competence. Which communicative competence would that be? Strategic, right? Strategic. And so this is a really key one, because this is preparing students to be able to grab onto a strategy that they can use again and again. They can use the next day in their work. They can use every day in their work. So very, very key. Okay. Now, final step. And to use my metaphor of panning for gold, this would be the last sieve, or the last kind of pan that we're using to look for gold. And this would be noticing the beginning, the middle, and the end. Noticing how the beginning works, noticing anything about the middle, noticing how the end works. Now, when I look across this text, I notice two things about the beginning. The first is that the title tells me what to expect. What are all these steps going to tell me how to do? So with a text like this, reading the title would be incredibly important. That's a really important way to how it begins. Another thing I notice about the beginning of this text, it leaps right in. There's no introduction. There's no fluffy kind of abstract paragraph telling me what to expect. It just leaps right in. And what does the middle look like? Well, the middle looks like step after step after step. What about the end? Let's look at step number 10. Look at that with me. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to see, is there anything different going on in step number 10? Check your crib weekly for loose bolts and sharp edges and ensure proper bedding. Keep your baby safe for as long as the crib is in use by checking that the bedding is not too hot, the crib is in good condition, and that your baby is not too big. This will help keep your baby safe while using your baby crib. Usually you would stop using the crib when the baby is 32 to 35 inches tall or climbing out of the crib. If your baby is able to climb out of his or her crib, you can also lower the bottom portion to keep your baby safe. Now, there's something different about that last step. What is it? How is the ending different? One thing I notice is that it's giving us advice on the actual use of the crib. I'm not getting advice anymore about how to put the crib together. Now the advice is how to use it safely, how to be safe, how to use it in the future, and how to check on it. Here's my guess, that for a lot of texts that are just like this, if we went and we found 10 other examples of directions about how to put something together, I bet it's very likely that they end by telling us how to keep the thing safe, how to be safe with the thing, how to use it in the future, how to check on it in the future. So that's my guess about how texts like this end. And certainly this one does. Okay. So I'm thinking that before you listen to this lecture, as you read this text, you might have been asking yourself, oh my goodness, what in the world would I teach my students? What in the world would I teach my students as they are preparing to read and possibly even write this kind of text, or to listen to this kind of direction, or even to give this kind of direction? And what we just did was we just found 10 different significant, some more significant than others, things about language that you could teach your students as you're preparing them for this kind of thing. And you could easily come up with 10 different lessons based on this information, and this is probably more than 10. But what I hope you see now is you see how to take a text or how to take a task and turn it into noticing the language that you need to teach your students in 10 easy steps. Maybe you don't agree with me, they're easy, but okay. Where do you go from here? Now that you've listened to this lecture, now that you've followed along and you've analyzed this text with me, I want you to read Chapter 3 in our textbook. Chapter 3 approaches how to analyze language from a slightly different standpoint. I've given you my kind of practical, very, very practical standpoint. So go ahead and read Chapter 3, and then I want you to do a few things. The first is, I have found a video of grocery store language, the language used in grocery stores. So I've got a video waiting there for you. What do I want you to do? I want you to try your hand in tackling the vocabulary. So I want you to listen multiple times, and as you're listening, I want you to identify some of those low-frequency vocabulary that it makes sense that someone working in a grocery store would need. Okay, so again, notice the low-frequency vocabulary items that would be very important for someone working in a grocery store to know. After that, what I would like you to do, if you didn't just take second language acquisition with me last quarter, what I would like you to do is to quickly look over the communicative competencies, the 4 communicative competencies, just to remind yourself about the 4 and how they're different. And then I want you to watch an amazing model. I think it's fantastic. It's an amazing model of someone attempting to teach the language of greetings. So they're looking at business English. How do people socially mingle? How do they introduce themselves? How do they make connections with other people? And you not only see an example of actors doing that, but you see someone attempting to explain to you or to students, how does that language work? So go ahead and watch that. It's a wonderful model. And then I want you to try this out yourself. So there is a hotel front desk example, a video for you to watch. And I want you, as you're watching that, I want you to use this template that I've created for you, not just for this class, but I'm hopeful that you'll take it with you into your career, and at least until you really start to get the hang of how to analyze language, you use it as your template each time you need to analyze language. You will recognize it basically looks like what we tackled today. It starts out by, you need to notice what's the primary skill that you're looking at and what's the secondary skill. So what does that mean? So when the skills are reading, writing, listening, speaking. For this text, if students are expected to read this kind of thing, the primary skill and the only skill would be reading. If you are preparing students to listen to a lecture, then the primary and the only skill that they would need is listening. If you are preparing your students to listen to a lecture and then ask questions afterwards, the primary skill would be listening and the secondary skill would be speaking. Okay? So that gives you a sense. So that is kind of a key first step that you will always, of course, want to carry out as you are analyzing language. Okay, so here's what I hope. I hope that if your kind of anxiety level about analyzing language was here at the beginning of this talk, it's farther down at this point. Okay, good luck with everything. Whatever you do, push yourself forward in knowing how and getting comfortable with analyzing language. Okay, I'll see you in the discussion.